Few rational, sane people believe in ghosts. However, back in 1973, a significant number of pilots and employees of Eastern Airlines reported encounters with the ghosts of deceased pilots. But let's go back to the beginning and try to understand where these ghosts came from. Around midnight on December 29, 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401, an L-1011 TriStar, en route from New York to Miami, was preparing to land at a Florida airport. The aircraft was operated by an experienced crew. At the controls was 55-year-old Robert Loft, a seasoned pilot with over 30 years of experience. Assisting him were First Officer Albert John Stockstill and Flight Engineer Donald Don Repo. The flight proceeded smoothly until the plane began its descent for landing. The captain issued the command to deploy the landing gear. The familiar sound of hydraulics engaging the gear mechanisms filled the cabin. But in that moment, First Officer Stockstill noticed something unusual. On the instrument panel before him, 2 indicator lights confirmed that the side landing gear was fully deployed. However, the third light, which signaled that the nose gear was locked in place, remained dark. A failure to deploy the nose gear could mean a belly landing, an event that might result in the aircraft breaking apart or catching fire upon impact. Captain Loft speculated that it could simply be a malfunctioning indicator light, rather than an issue with the gear itself. Still, this needed to be confirmed. To buy time, he requested clearance from air traffic control to abort the landing and circle back. The request was approved, and the aircraft was instructed to maintain an altitude of 2,000 feet. Captain Robert Loft then engaged the autopilot, and along with his crew, began troubleshooting the issue. Tragically, this decision would later prove to be a fatal mistake. Loft, Stockstill, and Repo tried several times to retract and release the landing gear, as well as remove and reinsert the light bulb from the instrument panel, but the result remained the same. 2 lights were on, and 1 was off. There was still a small hope of visually checking the landing gear in the black hole compartment, as it was called by the crew. This small observation window allowed them to inspect the gear, but since it was nighttime, all Flight Engineer Don Repo could see was pitch darkness. Unfortunately, the crew became so focused on solving the technical issue that they didn't notice the autopilot had disengaged. As a result, the plane began to slowly descend without anyone realizing it. As the investigation later revealed, after going around for a second attempt at landing, someone in the cockpit accidentally brushed the control yoke. This led to the autopilot being disengaged, and the plane began to gradually lose altitude. Once again, due to the nighttime conditions, the crew didn't immediately realize that the aircraft was descending. The cockpit voice recorder captured the last exchange between Captain Loft and First Officer Stockstill.
Something's wrong with our altitude.
What?
We're still at 2,000 feet, right?
Hey, what's happening?
Captain Loft barely managed to pull the control yoke back, but it was already too late. The aircraft, traveling at 230 miles per hour, crashed into a swamp 20 miles from the airport. The crash occurred at 11:42 p.m. local time. At the moment of the crash, 2 local fishermen were nearby and were the first to reach the scene of the disaster. They arrived in a small boat, and one of them, Robert Marquis, helped pull survivors out of the swampy waters and transported them to the nearest road, where they could be transferred to ambulances. Thanks to his efforts, dozens of lives were saved. Later, Robert would be awarded special recognition by the airline for his bravery. Initially, 99 people were confirmed dead in the crash, including 5 crew members, all 3 pilots and 2 flight attendants, and 94 passengers. The first officer, Albert Stockstill, died at the scene. Captain Loft survived the crash, but having lost a significant amount of blood, died in the cockpit before help arrived. Flight engineer Donald Don Repo also survived and awaited rescue, but sadly passed away in the hospital. 77 passengers and 8 flight attendants survived the crash. However, within 7 days of the incident, 2 more passengers succumbed to their injuries, bringing the death toll to 101. The crash remains one of the deadliest in aviation history, marked by the tragic loss of life and the heroic efforts of those who assisted in the aftermath. And finally, the most tragic discovery was that the only malfunction during the ill-fated flight was the indicator light itself. It had simply burned out, and all the landing gear had indeed been deployed and locked in place. Had the pilots realized this sooner, the plane would have landed safely at the Florida airport without incident, and 101 lives would have been saved. But what happened, happened. The cost of that fateful light bulb was just $12. Following this incident, a new rule was introduced for all flights. The rule stated that if any malfunction was detected, one of the pilots must remain in the cockpit and continue controlling the aircraft, without switching to autopilot mode. This rule was implemented to prevent a similar tragedy from occurring in the future, ensuring that the crew would remain fully aware of the aircraft's situation and capable of responding immediately to any problems. Soon after the tragic crash of Flight 401, flight attendants and pilots from Eastern Airlines began noticing something strange during flights on other L-1011 TriStar aircraft. On March 16, 1973, during a flight, 2 terrified flight attendants called the flight engineer to the kitchen and asked him to look through the small window at the far right side of the galley. When he looked, he saw the live face of a person staring back at them. In addition to the eerie sight, a voice was heard saying,
"Beware of a fire on this aircraft."
After these words, the apparition vanished. It was the ghost of flight engineer Don Repo. To the astonishment of the entire crew on that flight, their unexpected guess turned out to be right. Just before the plane was about to take off, one of the 3 engines failed. Unfortunately, it wasn't possible to repair the engine on site, so the decision was made to fly the plane using the 2 functioning engines. However, as soon as the aircraft reached an altitude of only 50 feet, one of the remaining engines began to smoke. Miraculously, the crew managed to bring the plane back to the ground and avoid a tragedy. Afterward, the crew recalled the ghost's warning words, but they all agreed it was just their imagination or a coincidence. However, what happened next seemed to cast aside all doubts, even among the most hardened skeptics. Before another flight of the same airline, flight number 318, when the captain entered the cockpit, he saw a man in uniform sitting in his seat. The figure introduced himself as the flight engineer from the previous flight, and he warned the captain about issues with the electrical circuit before vanishing into thin air. This eerie encounter left everyone shaken up, and it became increasingly difficult to dismiss the possibility that something truly supernatural was at work. The stunned pilot, still uncertain, insisted on a thorough recheck, and he was glad he did. The electrical circuit was indeed damaged. Another mysterious story was shared by the vice president of Eastern Airlines. He reportedly entered the first-class cabin and found a pilot already seated there. The vice president greeted him, but the pilot instantly vanished. However, just a brief glance at the pilot's face was enough for the vice president to recognize him. It was the deceased Bob Loft. It's important to note that these encounters with otherworldly entities were in fact life-saving. They helped prevent several potential aviation disasters. The airline staff even began referring to these apparitions as their guardian angels. Interestingly, the ghosts did not only appear to their fellow crew members, but also to regular passengers. Once again, on flight number 318, a passenger quietly sat next to an empty seat throughout the flight. However, just before landing in Phoenix, she suddenly screamed, broke into hysterics, and pointed frantically at the seat next to her. She incoherently explained that just a moment ago, a man had appeared out of nowhere in that seat, but he had disappeared as quickly as he came. Despite the crew's attempts to calm her down, the woman was inconsolable. After landing, the police were called, and she was restrained in a straitjacket. It's highly likely that she had indeed seen someone from the ill-fated crew of Flight 401. These strange events continued for about a year and a half. Initially, the management of Eastern Airlines tried to suppress the stories, but word slowly leaked to the press. To prevent the matter from gaining more attention and damaging their reputation, the airline's leadership took action. During an internal investigation, they uncovered something that was hard to believe. This discovery became their only lead in resolving the situation, and as time showed, it was the key to ending the eerie occurrences. The airline eventually decided to replace all the parts of the L-1011 TriStar fleet that had come from the wrecked Flight 401. Specifically, they removed the seats, instruments, and other components from the doomed plane. After these replacements, the haunting encounters ceased. Many believe that the spirits of the lost crew members had been somehow tethered to the remains of the aircraft. With these parts removed, the ghosts were no longer seen. The crucial detail was that the surviving parts and components from Flight 401 had not been properly decommissioned. Many of these parts were still in good condition, and in the interest of saving costs, the airline decided to install them in other aircraft of the same fleet. The majority of the salvaged parts, particularly the radio-electronic and galley equipment, yes, the very same equipment in which the flight attendants had seen the ghostly face, ended up on another L-1011 TriStar, flight number 318. And by a strange twist of fate, this particular aircraft became the site of the most frequent and unsettling supernatural occurrences. Another intriguing fact is that this kitchen equipment was located near the black hole compartment, the very place where flight engineer Don Repo had been trapped after the crash, and where it seemed his spirit lingered. This eerie connection between the equipment and the apparitions has led many to speculate that the restless spirits of the lost crew were somehow bound to the parts of the destroyed plane. When those components were installed on Flight 318, the hauntings began again. A decision was made to remove these components and replace them with new ones. And this indeed yielded results. After the parts were replaced, none of the ghosts were ever seen again on any aircraft. It seemed that some fragment of the crew from Flight 401 remained forever tied to those parts. They may have felt responsible for what had happened to their flight, and in their spectral form, they tried to help and warn other planes from suffering a similar fate. It's worth acknowledging that their efforts were not in vain. They indeed prevented several potential disasters and saved hundreds of lives. Despite the tragic end to their own journey, the spirits of Flight 401 seem to play an unexpected role in safeguarding future flights, a strange and poignant chapter in aviation history. The story itself became so popular that a TV series and a film were later based on it.